Broken Chains Trust. Josephine Joe McGraw had always been warned about men like Jack Mercer drifters with silver tongues and hands that knew too much. But when he pulled her into a darkened alley, his fingers rough and knowing, she forgot every warning. He smirked, his breath warm against her ear. "You keep looking at me like that, sweetheart," he murmured. "And I might just take it as an invitation." Chapter 1. A Kiss Before Sundown. The dust swirled around Josephine Joe McGraw's worn leather boots, a miniature desert cyclone mirroring the tempest brewing inside her. The setting sun bled across the vast New Mexico sky, painting the clouds in hues of fiery orange and bruised purple. The air, thick with the scent of sage and distant wood smoke, did little to soothe the raw edges of her nerves. She tugged the brim of her hat lower, shielding her eyes not just from the sun, but from the prying eyes of redemption, a town that thrived on gossip as much as it did on the meager silver pulled from the nearby mines. She'd been avoiding this part of town, the lower end where the saloons spilled their raucous noise and questionable clientele onto the dusty street. But the blacksmith, old Silas, had sent her to fetch a specialized hammer, one he claimed only Murdoch's emporium carried. Murdoch's, unfortunately, sat squarely in the heart of Redemption's sin-soaked underbelly. Jo gripped the worn handle of her father's Colt Peacemaker, nestled securely beneath her duster. It was a weight she'd carried since she was 15, a constant reminder of the fragility of life on the frontier and the ever-present need for protection. Her father, God rest his soul, had drilled it into her. Trust no one, Jo. Especially not a man with easy charm and eyes that promise the world. She'd almost made it. Almost slipped past the Golden Barrel Saloon, the source of the most boisterous laughter and the clinking of glasses that grated on her ears. Then, a figure detached itself from the shadows leaning against the saloon wall tall, lean, and undeniably dangerous. Jack Mercer. He moved with a predator's grace, all coiled muscle and simmering intensity. Jo had seen him around, of course. A drifter, they said. Arrived a few weeks back, stirring up trouble and turning heads with equal measure. He had a reputation, one whispered in hushed tones behind cupped hands. A gunslinger, some claimed. A gambler, others muttered. A heartbreaker, the young women sighed, their eyes filled with a dangerous mix of fear and fascination. Jo had tried to ignore him, to dismiss him as another fleeting shadow in a town full of them. But there was something about him, a darkness that both repelled and intrigued her. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a glint of something that made her breath catch in her throat. He blocked her path, his presence filling her vision. He smelled of whiskey, leather, and something wilder, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. "Evenin', Miss McGraw," he drawled, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. His lips curved into a slow, knowing smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Jo stiffened, her hand instinctively tightening on the Colt beneath her coat. "Mr. Mercer," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite the sudden hammering of her heart. "I'm in a hurry." He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Always in a hurry, aren't you, Jo? Running from something? Or someone?" She bristled at the familiarity, at the way he said her name, like he had some claim to it. "I have business to attend to." He leaned closer, his shadow falling over her, engulfing her in his scent and his heat. "Business, is it? Or are you afraid of what might happen if you slow down, let yourself feel something?" His words, though softly spoken, struck a nerve. Jo had spent years building walls around her heart, burying her emotions beneath a layer of stoicism and self-reliance. The death of her father, 5 years prior, had only reinforced her resolve to remain detached, to avoid the pain of connection. But Mercer, with his unsettling gaze and his uncanny ability to see through her defenses, threatened to shatter that carefully constructed facade. She took a step back, trying to put some distance between them, but he mirrored her movement, closing the gap. He was too close, invading her personal space, forcing her to acknowledge the undeniable pull between them. A pull she desperately wanted to resist. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice a little breathless now. He raised an eyebrow, his smile widening. "Don't you?" "I think you do. I think you feel it too, this spark, this fire." He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, sending a jolt of electricity through her. It was a fleeting touch, barely there, but it left her skin tingling and her heart racing. She flinched, pulling away from his touch as if burned. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the din of the saloon. He didn't retreat. Instead, he stepped closer, his body almost touching hers. He lowered his head, his breath warm against her ear. It was then, in that darkened alley, with the scent of dust and danger swirling around them, that he spoke the words that would change everything. The words, and that kiss. "You keep looking at me like that, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice a rough caress. "And I might just take it as an invitation." And then he did. He took. His lips, surprisingly soft against hers, claimed, plundered, and left. It was not a long kiss, but the imprint, the heat, that he'd branded her with made her feel like she'd been struck by lightning. Her mind, usually so sharp and focused, went blank. All she could feel was the pressure of his mouth on hers, the rough scratch of his stubble against her skin, the intoxicating taste of whiskey, and something more. He pulled back, leaving her dazed and disoriented, her lips throbbing, her body trembling. He looked at her, his eyes dark and intense, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The kiss, that brief, stolen moment, had spoken volumes. It was a challenge, a promise, a threat. It was a declaration of war on the carefully constructed walls around her heart. And Jo, despite her fear, despite her better judgment, felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Desire. A dangerous, intoxicating, undeniable desire. And with it, the rising tide of panic. What would he do next? Chapter 2. The Whispers of Redemption. The echo of the kiss, the phantom pressure of Jack Mercer's lips, lingered on Jo's skin like a brand. She stood frozen in the alleyway, the sounds of redemption, the raucous laughter, the clatter of horses' hooves, the tinny piano music fading into a dull roar in her ears. Her hand, still trembling, instinctively went to her mouth, as if to hold the sensation captive. She felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped bare by a single, unexpected touch. He was gone, vanished back into the shadows from whence he came, leaving her standing there, reeling and breathless, in the fading light. She forced herself to move, her legs feeling strangely heavy, her boots scuffing against the rough ground. She needed to get away, to find a quiet place to collect her thoughts, to understand what had just happened. Murdoch's Emporium was a haven of sorts, a dimly lit, cluttered space filled with the comforting smells of leather, oil, and metal. Old Man Murdoch, his face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by years of sun and hardship, barely glanced up from his ledger as she entered. "Hammer," Jo managed to say, her voice raspy and unfamiliar. "Silas sent me. For a specialized thing." Murdoch grunted, his eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, finally focusing on her. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp and knowing. "You look like you've seen a ghost, girl," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "You flinchel, her cheeks burning." "Just the heat," she mumbled, turning away to avoid his scrutiny. He didn't press her. He simply pointed a gnarled finger towards a back room, overflowing with tools of every shape and size. "Back there. You'll find it." She spent longer than necessary searching for the hammer, her mind replaying the encounter with Mercer over and over again. The way he'd looked at her, the way he'd touched her, the way he'd kissed her, it was all so unsettling, so intoxicating. She hated it. She hated him. And yet a part of her, a deeply buried, long dormant part, felt a spark of something she couldn't deny. Something that scared her more than any outlaw or gunslinger ever could. When she finally emerged from the back room, hammer in hand, Murdoch was waiting for her, a knowing glint in his eye. "Heard Mercer's been stirring up trouble again," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "He's got away with women, that one. But he's trouble, Jo. Best stay clear.
Jag stiftskrädd.
I can handle myself, she said, her voice tight with defiance. Murdoch chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Maybe so, but some fires are best left unlit. They burn too hot, consume everything in their path. His words, meant as a warning, only fueled the embers of rebellion simmering within her. She paid for the hammer, her movements stiff and deliberate, and left the Emporium, stepping back out into the twilight. The town seemed different now, transformed by the encounter with Mercer. The shadows seemed deeper, the whispers louder, the air thick with unspoken secrets. She walked quickly, her head down, her hand resting on the Colt beneath her duster. She felt watched, scrutinized, judged. As she passed the Golden Barrel Saloon, she heard her name, spoken in a low, husky voice.
Ja.
She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She could feel his presence, a magnetic force pulling her towards him. She hesitated, her mind warring with her instincts. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to keep walking, to ignore him, to run. But something, some reckless, defiant impulse, made her stop. She slowly turned, her gaze meeting his across the dusty street. He was leaning against the saloon wall again, his posture relaxed, his eyes gleaming in the dim light cast by the flickering lanterns. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. The whispers started again, louder now, more insistent. She could feel the eyes of the town upon them, curious, judgmental, expectant. She knew what they were thinking. She knew the stories they were already weaving. The Widow McGraw and the Dangerous Drifter. It was a story that would spread like wildfire through redemption, feeding the town's insatiable appetite for gossip and scandal. And in that moment, standing there in the dusty street, facing the man who had just turned her world upside down, Jo McGraw made a decision. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. She would face him, and whatever consequences might follow, head on. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and started walking towards him, the setting sun casting long, dramatic shadows behind her. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Her life in redemption would never be the same.
She had felt something.
And that changed everything. Chapter 3. Shadows on the Mesa. The distance between them seemed to stretch on forever, each step Jo took echoing in the sudden hush that had fallen over the street. The usual cacophony of the Golden Barrel Saloon seemed to have muted, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting to see what would unfold. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the unspoken questions, the barely concealed judgments. But she ignored them, her focus locked on the man leaning against the saloon wall, his figure silhouetted against the flickering lamplight. As she drew closer, she could see the details of his face more clearly. The hard line of his jaw, the slight stubble that shadowed his cheeks, the intensity of his eyes, which seemed to bore into her soul. He hadn't moved, his posture still relaxed, but there was a coiled tension in his body, a readiness that sent a shiver down her spine. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, stopping a few feet away from him. The space felt charged, electric, dangerous. "Jo," he replied, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air. "Thought you might keep walking." "I don't run from things," she said, her chin lifting slightly. It was a lie, or at least a partial one. She had been running from things for years, from grief, from loneliness, from the very emotions that now threatened to overwhelm her. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
"Don't you?"
"We all run from something, Jo. The question is, what are you running from?" His words struck a nerve, hitting too close to the truth. She averted her gaze, looking out at the darkening mesa that loomed over the town, its jagged peaks silhouetted against the fading light. The shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching out like grasping fingers, reaching for her. "I have nothing to run from," she said, her voice a little tighter now. He pushed himself off the wall, taking a step closer. The scent of whiskey and leather intensified, filling her senses, making her head spin. "Don't you?" "I think you do." I think you're running from yourself, Joe. From the fire I saw in your eyes, the fire I felt on your lips. She flinched, his words a direct hit. She hated that he could see through her, that he could read her so easily. She hated the way he made her feel, the way he stirred up emotions she had long tried to bury. That was a mistake, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It shouldn't have happened. Shouldn't it? He asked, his voice a silken caress. Or are you just afraid to admit that it felt right? She didn't answer, her silence a confession in itself. She couldn't deny the truth, not to him, not to herself. The kiss had felt right, in a way that terrified her. It had awakened something within her, a longing she had thought long dead. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, sending a jolt of electricity through her. She didn't pull away this time, her body frozen, her mind reeling. I'm not going to apologize, Joe, he said, his voice low and intense. I don't regret it. And I don't think you do either. She finally met his gaze, her eyes searching his. She saw a flicker of something there, something that looked like vulnerability. A hint of the darkness he carried, the shadows that haunted him. Who are you, Jack Mercer? She whispered, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. He smiled, a sad, wistful smile. Just a drifter, Joe. Passing through. But maybe I could be more.
If you'd let me.
His words hung in the air, a promise, a challenge, a threat. She didn't know what to believe, what to trust. She only knew that this man, this dangerous, enigmatic stranger, had awakened something within her that she couldn't ignore. And that she was standing at a crossroads, a point of no return. I need to go, she said, her voice trembling slightly. She turned to leave, her heart pounding in her chest. He didn't try to stop her. He simply watched her go, his eyes following her until she disappeared into the darkness, the shadows of the mesa swallowing her whole. As she walked, the weight of the hammer in her hand felt heavier than ever, a reminder of the work that awaited her, the life she had built, the walls she had erected. But the walls were cracking, crumbling under the force of a single kiss, a single touch, a single, undeniable connection. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Jack Mercer was not a man who would be easily dismissed. He was a storm on the horizon, and she was caught in its path. And the storm, it seemed, was heading straight for her heart. It was just past sundown, and she felt like she was losing all control. Chapter 4. The Price of Silence. The McGraw Ranch was a sprawling, ramshackle affair, nestled in a valley several miles outside of Redemption. It had been her father's pride and joy, built with his own 2 hands, a testament to his grit and determination. Now it was Joe's responsibility, a burden she carried with a mixture of love and resentment. The ride home was quiet, the only sounds the rhythmic beat of her horse's hooves and the mournful cry of a distant coyote. The stars were out, a million pinpricks of light in the vast, inky sky. The air was cool, a welcome relief from the stifling heat of the day, but it did little to calm the turmoil inside her. She replayed the encounter with Jack Mercer again and again, each replay adding a new layer of confusion and uncertainty. His words, his touch, his kiss, they had all left an indelible mark on her, stirring up emotions she had long tried to suppress. She was angry with him for disrupting her carefully ordered life, for forcing her to confront feelings she wasn't ready to face. But she was also angry with herself for allowing him to get under her skin, for responding to him in a way that betrayed her own carefully guarded heart. As she approached the ranch house, she saw a light flickering in the window. Her foreman, Caleb, was waiting up for her. Caleb was a grizzled, taciturn man, a few years older than her father had been, loyal to the McGraw family to a fault. He'd been with them since Joe was a child, a steady presence in her life, a surrogate father figure after her own father's death. He was standing on the porch, his silhouette outlined against the warm glow of the lamplight, his rifle leaning against the railing. He watched her dismount, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "You're late," he said, his voice gruff, but laced with concern. "Had to go to Murdoch's," Joe replied, handing him the reins. Silas needed a hammer. Caleb grunted, his eyes scanning her face. "You all right, Joe? You look unsettled." She hesitated, unsure whether to confide in him. Caleb was a man of few words, but he was also fiercely protective of her. She knew he wouldn't approve of her encounter with Mercer. He wouldn't understand the complicated mix of emotions that were churning inside her. "Just tired," she said, forcing a smile. "It's been a long day." He didn't press her, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. He knew her too well, had seen her through too much, to be easily fooled. They went inside, the house filled with the familiar smells of wood smoke and coffee. Caleb had left a pot simmering on the stove, and the aroma filled Joe with a sense of comfort, a reminder of the simple, predictable routines of her life. A life that now felt irrevocably altered. She sat down at the rough-hewn wooden table, Caleb across from her, and accepted the cup of coffee he poured. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice low and serious. "Heard some talk in town," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. "About you and that drifter, Mercer." Joe's heart sank. She'd known the gossip would spread quickly, but she hadn't expected it to reach Caleb so soon. "It's nothing," she said, trying to sound dismissive. "Just idle talk." Caleb shook his head, his expression grim. "It ain't nothing, Joe. Mercer's got a reputation. He's dangerous. You need to stay away from him." "I can handle myself," she repeated, the same words she'd used with Murdoch. But they sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Caleb leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Joe, I promised your pa'd look out for you. I ain't gonna let some smooth-talking gunslinger take advantage of you." "He's not taking advantage of me," Joe protested, her voice rising slightly. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like, Joe?" Caleb asked, his voice softening.
Tell me. Help me understand.
She opened her mouth to speak, to explain the confusing, contradictory emotions that were swirling inside her, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't articulate the strange pull she felt towards Mercer, the way he made her feel both terrified and alive. She couldn't explain the kiss, the memory of which still made her skin tingle and her heart race. She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know," she whispered. I don't know." Caleb sighed, his shoulders slumping. He reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. "Joe," he said, his voice filled with a weary sadness. "I know you're lonely. I know you miss your pa. But Mercer, he's not the answer. He'll only bring you heartache. He's a shadow, Joe, and shadows, they fade. They disappear, and you can never hold on to them." But was it the shadows, or the price of silence, that weighed more heavily on her? She could not say. Only that the silence was growing, and with it, a sense of dread. She had to tell someone the truth, but how? Chapter 5. A Storm Gathering. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Jo threw herself into the work of the ranch, trying to outrun the thoughts and feelings that continued to plague her. She mended fences, checked on the cattle, helped Caleb with the branding. The physical labor was exhausting, but it provided a welcome distraction from the turmoil inside her. But she couldn't escape the whispers. Everywhere she went in town, she felt the eyes upon her, heard the muttered comments, saw the knowing glances. The story of her encounter with Jack Mercer had spread like wildfire, growing more elaborate and scandalous with each retelling. Some whispered that she was infatuated with the dangerous drifter, others that she was being foolishly reckless, courting disaster. She tried to ignore it, to pretend that it didn't bother her. But the constant scrutiny, the judgment, the unspoken disapproval, weighed heavily on her. She felt isolated, alone, trapped in a cage of her own making. She hadn't seen Mercer since that night outside the Golden Barrel Saloon. She'd half expected him to seek her out, to try to continue what he'd started. But he'd remained elusive, a ghost in the shadows, a constant presence in her thoughts, but absent from her sight. The weather mirrored her inner turmoil. The sky, which had been clear and bright, turned overcast, a thick layer of gray clouds obscuring the sun. The wind picked up, whipping across the plains, carrying with it the scent of dust and the threat of rain. A storm was gathering, both literally and figuratively. One afternoon, Jo was riding back to the ranch after checking on a remote section of fence line when she saw a figure on horseback approaching her. Her heart leaped into her throat, a mixture of fear and anticipation coursing through her veins. It was him. Jack Mercer rode towards her with an easy grace, his body moving in perfect rhythm with his horse. He was wearing a dark duster, his hat pulled low over his eyes, obscuring his face. But she recognized the way he sat in the saddle, the confident, almost arrogant way he held himself. As he drew closer, he raised his hand in greeting, a slight smile playing on his lips. He reined in his horse a few feet away from her, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, locking onto hers. "Jo," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air.
"I've been looking for you."
She swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, and walked towards her. He stopped close, too close, invading her personal space, forcing her to acknowledge the undeniable pull between them. "I wanted to see you," he said, his voice soft, intimate.
"To talk to you."
"About what?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, sending a jolt of electricity through her. She didn't pull away, her body frozen, her mind reeling. "About us," he said, his eyes searching hers. "About what happened the other night. About what could happen." She averted her gaze, looking out at the darkening sky. The wind was whipping around them, tearing at her hat, stinging her eyes. "There's no us," she said, her voice tight with denial. "There can't be." He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Don't you think that's for me to decide?" He took a step closer. She didn't retreat. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You don't know what I've been through." "I know enough," he said, his voice softening. "I know you're strong, resilient, beautiful. I know you're lonely, hurting, afraid. And I know that you feel something for me, Jo, whether you want to admit it or not." His words struck a chord, hitting too close to the truth. She couldn't deny the connection she felt with him, the way he made her feel alive, awakened, challenged. But she also knew that he was dangerous, that he represented everything she'd been taught to fear, everything she'd tried to avoid. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising wind. "I just can't." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He held her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and determination. "Jo," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I know you're scared, but I'm not going to hurt you.
I promise you that."
She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him. But the doubts, the fears, the whispers, they were all too strong. She pulled her hand away, her eyes filling with tears. "I have to go," she said, her voice breaking. She turned her horse, ready to flee, to escape the storm that was raging both inside and outside of her. But before she could ride away, he spoke again, his voice stopping her in her tracks. "They're coming for me, Jo," he said, his voice grim, serious. "And when they do, they might come for you too." The storm broke then, not just in the sky, but within her. His words were a thunderclap, a lightning strike. What did he mean? Who was coming? And why would they come for her? Chapter 6. The Ballad of Broken Oaths. The rain lashed down, turning the dusty ground into a muddy quagmire. Jo's horse skittered nervously, its hooves slipping on the slick surface. She urged it forward, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. Mercer's words echoed in her ears, a chilling premonition of danger. "They're coming for me, Jo. And when they do, they might come for you too." She didn't know who they were or why they were after him. But she knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was telling the truth. She'd seen the fear in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. It was a fear that mirrored her own, a fear that had been growing steadily since their first encounter. She rode hard, pushing her horse to its limits, desperate to reach the safety of the ranch house. The storm raged around her, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain stinging her face, blurring her vision. She felt exposed, vulnerable, hunted. As she neared the ranch, she saw a flicker of movement in the distance. Several riders, silhouetted against the stormy sky, were approaching at a gallop. Her blood ran cold. She recognized them instantly. The Blackwood brothers. The Blackwoods were a notorious outlaw gang, known for their ruthlessness and brutality. They'd been terrorizing the territory for months, robbing banks, rustling cattle, leaving a trail of destruction and death in their wake. Joe had heard stories about them, whispered in hushed tones around campfires and in saloons. Stories of their cruelty, their disregard for the law, their insatiable greed. She knew why they were here. They were after Mercer. And she, because of her association with him, had become a target. She spurred her horse onward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to warn Caleb, had to get to the house, had to find some way to protect herself, to protect the ranch. She burst through the gate, her horse sliding to a halt in the muddy yard. Caleb was there, his rifle in hand, his face grim, his eyes scanning the horizon. He'd seen them too. Blackwoods. Joe gasped, her breath coming in ragged sobs. They're coming. Caleb nodded, his expression hardening. I know. Get inside, Joe.
Now.
But Mercer, she started, her voice trembling. He said Mercer's not our concern right now, Caleb interrupted, his voice sharp. Our concern is protecting this ranch, protecting you. Get inside and stay there. She hesitated, torn between her fear for herself and her concern for Mercer. She knew he was out there, somewhere, alone and outnumbered. She knew he needed help. But she also knew that Caleb was right. She couldn't risk her own life, couldn't risk the lives of the ranch hands, by trying to help a man who was clearly embroiled in something dangerous and deadly. She reluctantly obeyed, running towards the house, her boots sinking into the mud. She looked back, just once, and saw Caleb standing his ground, his rifle raised, his figure silhouetted against the stormy sky. He was a lone warrior, facing an overwhelming force, a symbol of the courage and resilience that defined the frontier spirit. She barricaded herself inside the house, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. She grabbed her father's Colt Peacemaker, the familiar weight comforting in her grip. She checked the loads, her movements practiced and efficient. She was ready to fight, to defend her home, to defend her life. The sounds of the approaching riders grew louder, the thunder of their hooves mixing with the roar of the storm. She peered through the window, her breath catching in her throat. There were at least a dozen of them, heavily armed, their faces hidden by bandanas, their eyes glinting with malice. They surrounded the house, their horses circling, their voices raised in shouts and threats. Joe could hear Caleb's voice, calm and defiant, challenging them, refusing to back down. She knew this was a fight they couldn't win. They were outnumbered, outgunned, outmatched. But she also knew that they wouldn't surrender. They would fight to the bitter end, defending their home, their land, their way of life. Suddenly, a shot rang out, followed by another and another. The sound of gunfire echoed through the valley, a terrifying symphony of violence. Joe's heart clenched with fear. She closed her eyes, her mind filled with images of Caleb, of Mercer, of the life she had known, all slipping away, lost in the storm, lost in the violence, lost in the ballad of broken oaths that seemed to define this harsh and unforgiving land. She had to do something. But what? And how could one woman stand against so many? The gunfire continued, each shot a nail in the coffin of her hope. Chapter 7. Echoes in the Canyon. The gunfire intensified, a relentless barrage that shook the very foundations of the house. Joe gripped the Colt tighter, her knuckles white, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She peered through the window, her vision blurred by the rain and the tears that streamed down her face. She could see the Blackwoods, their figures shadowy and menacing in the storm, their horses rearing and plunging, their guns blazing. Caleb was still standing, firing back with a grim determination, but He was surrounded, overwhelmed. She saw him take a hit, his body jerking, his rifle falling from his grasp.
Caleb!
Jo screamed, her voice lost in the roar of the storm and the cacophony of gunfire. She knew she had to do something, anything, to help him. She couldn't just stand there and watch him die. She couldn't let the Blackwoods destroy everything she held dear. She threw open the door, ignoring the shouts of warning from inside the house, and stepped out into the storm. The rain lashed at her, soaking her to the bone, the wind tearing at her clothes. She raised the Colt, her hand surprisingly steady despite the fear that gripped her. She fired, aiming at the closest rider. The shot went wide, missing its target, but it had the desired effect. The Blackwoods, momentarily surprised by her sudden appearance, turned their attention to her. Well, a voice drawled, a voice filled with menace and amusement. Look what we have here. The little widow McGraw. It was Jedediah Blackwood, the leader of the gang, a tall, gaunt man with a cruel face and eyes that glinted with a cold, predatory light. He rode towards her, his horse prancing nervously, his gun trained on her. "You should have stayed inside, little lady," he said, his voice a sneering whisper. "Now you've made things complicated." Jo stood her ground, her chin lifted, her eyes defiant. "Get off my land," she said, her voice surprisingly strong, despite the tremor in her body. Jedediah laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Your land? This land belongs to whoever's strong enough to take it. And right now, that's us." He gestured towards Caleb, who was lying on the ground, bleeding and unconscious, but still alive. "Your man put up a good fight, but it wasn't enough. Now it's your turn." Jo knew she was outmatched. She was one woman against a dozen heavily armed outlaws. She had no chance of winning, but she wouldn't surrender. She wouldn't let them take her without a fight. She raised the Colt again, aiming at Jedediah's chest. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Suddenly, a shot rang out from behind her, from the direction of the canyon that bordered the ranch. One of the Blackwoods slumped in his saddle, his body falling to the ground with a thud. The outlaws, momentarily stunned, looked around in confusion, their eyes searching for the source of the shot. Another shot rang out, and another, each one finding its mark. The Blackwoods scattered, their horses rearing and screaming, their formation broken. Jo didn't hesitate. She took advantage of the chaos, firing her own gun, aiming at the remaining riders. She hit one, then another, her shots surprisingly accurate, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. The tide of the battle had turned. The Blackwoods, caught off guard and outnumbered by an unseen enemy, were retreating, fleeing back towards the canyon, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Jo lowered her gun, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked around, her eyes searching for the source of the shots that had saved her, that had saved Caleb, that had saved the ranch. Then she saw him. He emerged from the shadows of the canyon, riding slowly towards her, his figure silhouetted against the stormy sky. It was Jack Mercer. He was covered in mud and rain, his clothes torn, his face grim, but his eyes were filled with a fierce, protective light. He was a one-man army. He was a savior. He was a dangerous man she could no longer deny her attraction for. He dismounted, his movements stiff and weary, and walked towards her. He stopped close, his gaze locking onto hers. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She was overwhelmed by a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a growing, undeniable sense of connection to this man who had just risked his life to save hers. The canyon echoed with the sounds of the retreating outlaws, but all Jo could hear was the beating of her own heart and the unspoken question that hung in the air between them. Who was he really? And what did his arrival truly mean for her future? The echoes seemed to say everything. Chapter 8. The Devil's Bargain. The immediate aftermath of the attack was a blur of activity. Jo, with Mercer's help, managed to get Caleb into the house and tend to his wounds. He was badly hurt, a bullet having grazed his shoulder, and another lodging dangerously close to his spine, but he was alive. Mercer, surprisingly, had some experience with doctoring, his hands surprisingly gentle as he cleaned and bandaged Caleb's injuries. The other ranch hands, who had taken shelter during the shootout, emerged cautiously, their faces pale and shaken. They helped carry the bodies of the dead Blackwoods away, their movements somber and respectful. The storm had passed, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a heavy silence that hung in the air. Joe watched Mercer as he worked, his brow furrowed in concentration, his movements precise and efficient. She couldn't reconcile the image of the dangerous drifter with the man who was now tending to Caleb with such care and compassion. She saw the lines of exhaustion etched on his face, the dark circles under his eyes, the weariness that seemed to cling to him like a shroud. Once Caleb was settled, as comfortable as he could be under the circumstances, Joe and Mercer found themselves alone in the kitchen. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, filled with unspoken questions and emotions. Joe poured them both a cup of coffee, her hands still trembling slightly. She sat down at the table, her gaze fixed on Mercer.
Why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why did you come back? He looked at her, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, filled with a mixture of weariness and something else, something that looked like regret. I told you, he said, his voice rough. They were coming for me, and I knew they'd come for you too.
But why?
She persisted. Who are they? What do they want? He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. He looked out the window, at the ravaged landscape, the lingering signs of a storm. It's a long story, he said, his voice low and strained. A complicated one. I have time, she said, her voice firmer now. And I deserve answers. You saved my life, Jack. You saved Caleb's life. You saved this ranch. I owe you everything. He turned back to her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the determination in her gaze, the unwavering resolve. He knew he couldn't avoid the truth any longer. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. The Blackwoods, they're not just outlaws, he said, his voice heavy with a weariness that seemed to go beyond the physical. They were my family. Joe's eyes widened in shock. Your family? She whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. He nodded, his expression grim. My brothers. My cousins. My uncle, Jedediah, he raised me. After my parents died. He began to tell her his story, a story filled with violence, betrayal, and a desperate attempt to escape a life he no longer wanted. He'd grown up in the shadow of the Blackwood gang, immersed in their world of crime and lawlessness. He'd ridden with them, robbed with them, killed with them. But he'd always been different. He'd never had the same taste for blood, the same disregard for human life. He'd yearned for something more, something better, something cleaner. A few months ago, he'd finally broken away. He'd left the gang, determined to start a new life, to leave his past behind. But the Blackwoods hadn't let him go easily. They'd hunted him, pursued him, determined to bring him back, or to kill him for his betrayal. I made a devil's bargain, he confessed, looking away from her, shame coloring his words. I thought I could outrun my past, outrun my family. But I was wrong. They'll never let me go. And now they've brought you into it. It wasn't your fault, Joe said, her voice surprisingly gentle. She reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His skin was rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and despair. I put you in danger, Joe. I brought this upon you.
I'm so sorry.
You saved us, she said, her voice firm. You could have run. You could have left us to face them alone. But you didn't. You came back. You risked your life for us. That's all that matters. He closed his eyes and took his hand back. He felt unworthy. What happens now?
She had to know.
He looked tired and old. Now, he said, a haunted look in his stormy eyes. I finished this. One way or another. The unspoken words hung between them. Even if it kills me. The devil's bargain, it seemed, was coming due, and Joe was terrified that she would be the one to pay the ultimate price. Chapter 9. Beneath a Blood Moon. The days following the attack were tense and uneasy. Caleb remained bedridden, his recovery slow and painful. Joe tended to him with a fierce devotion, her worry for him a constant ache in her chest. She also had to manage the ranch, overseeing the repairs, dealing with the frightened and demoralized ranch hands, and trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy in the face of the looming threat. Mercer stayed at the ranch, ostensibly to help with the repairs and to protect them from any further attacks.
But Joe knew there was more to it than that.
He was waiting, watching, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with his former family. He was a changed man after the shootout. The easy charm, the playful banter, the hint of arrogance were gone. He was withdrawn, silent, his eyes haunted by a darkness that seemed to deepen with each passing day. He spent most of his time alone, patrolling the perimeter of the ranch, checking his weapons, his movements restless and agitated. Joe found herself drawn to him, despite her better judgment, despite the fear that still gnawed at her. She felt a connection to him, a shared understanding of loss and pain, a recognition of the burdens they both carried. She tried to talk to him, to understand what he was going through, to offer him some comfort, some support. But he remained closed off, his emotions guarded, his thoughts hidden behind a wall of silence. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, dramatic shadows across the valley, Joe found Mercer standing by the corral, watching the horses. The sky was a fiery tapestry of orange, red, and purple, a breathtaking display of natural beauty that contrasted sharply with the darkness that seemed to engulf him. She approached him slowly, her footsteps soft on the dusty ground. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence, but she knew he was aware of her. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her voice a soft murmur in the stillness of the evening. He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Caleb's getting stronger," she continued, trying to break through his silence.
"He's asking for you."
"He wants to thank you." Still no response.
"You sat, her shoulders slumping."
She felt a wave of frustration, of helplessness. She wanted to reach him, to break through his walls, to understand the torment that was raging inside him. "Jack," she said, her voice pleading.
"Talk to me, please."
He finally turned, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, meeting hers. He looked exhausted, defeated, his spirit broken. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice rough and hoarse. "That's not true," she said, her voice firm. "You're hurting. I can see it. Let me help you." He shook his head, his expression grim. "You can't help me, Joe. No one can." "Don't say that," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You're not alone. I'm here. We're all here for you." He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that sent a chill down her spine. "You don't understand, Joe. You don't know what I've done, what I'm capable of." "I know you saved us," she said, her voice unwavering. "I know you're a good man, Jack. Despite everything." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and despair. He wanted to believe her, to accept her offer of comfort, of connection. But he couldn't. He was too burdened by his past, too consumed by his guilt, too afraid of what the future held. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was a gesture of tenderness, of vulnerability, a glimpse of the man he had been, the man he could be. But then, he pulled away, his hand dropping to his side, his expression hardening. "It's going to happen tonight," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They're coming back. To finish it." Joe's heart sank. She'd known this was coming, but hearing him say it, seeing the certainty in his eyes, filled her with a sense of dread. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I know them," he said, his voice grim. "I know their ways. And tonight is a blood moon." Joe looked up at the sky. The full moon was rising, large and luminous, its light tinged with a reddish hue. A blood moon, a symbol of violence, of bloodshed, of impending doom. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We fight," he said, his voice unwavering.
"We fight for our lives.
"We fight for our future. We fight until the end." The blood moon hung heavy in the sky, casting an eerie, ominous glow over the ranch, over their lives, over the battle that was about to begin. And Joe knew, with a chilling certainty, that this night would change everything. Forever. Chapter 10. The Long Road Home. The hours before the expected attack stretched on, filled with a tense, almost unbearable anticipation. Joe and Mercer, along with the remaining ranch hands, prepared for the inevitable. They barricaded the doors and windows, checked their weapons, and positioned themselves strategically around the house and outbuildings. Joe found herself working alongside Mercer, their movements synchronized, their communication minimal but efficient. She saw the steely determination in his eyes, the grim set of his jaw, the way he moved with a quiet, deadly grace. He was a warrior, preparing for battle, his focus absolute, his emotions buried deep beneath a layer of stoicism. She tried to ignore the fear that gnawed at her, the sense of impending doom that hung heavy in the air. She focused on the task at hand, on the need to protect herself, to protect Caleb, to protect the ranch. She drew strength from Mercer's presence, from his unwavering resolve, from the unspoken connection that bound them together. As darkness fell, the blood moon rose higher in the sky, casting an eerie, reddish glow over the landscape. The silence was broken only by the occasional howl of a coyote, the rustling of the wind, the creak of the old house settling. Joe found herself standing beside Mercer on the porch, their shoulders almost touching, their gazes fixed on the distant horizon. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and something else, something that felt like a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. "Thank you," Joe said, her voice soft, barely audible above the whisper of the wind. He turned to her, his eyes, reflecting the reddish light of the moon, searching hers. "For what?" he asked, his voice rough. "For everything," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "For saving us. For staying. For being here." He didn't answer, but his gaze softened, a flicker of something that looked like tenderness crossing his features. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down her spine. "I couldn't leave you, Joe," he said, his voice low and intimate. Not after everything." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. There was only the two of them, standing there in the moonlight, connected by a bond that defied logic, that transcended fear, that hinted at something deeper, something more profound. But the moment was shattered by the sound of approaching riders, the thunder of their hooves growing louder, closer, more menacing. The Blackwoods were here. Mercer's hand dropped from her cheek, his body tensing, his eyes hardening. He drew his gun, his movements swift and decisive. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice a low, urgent command.
"And be ready."
Joe nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She drew her own gun, her father's Colt Peacemaker, the familiar weight comforting in her grip. She was ready. She would fight. She would survive. She would face whatever the night held, alongside the man who had become her unexpected protector, her unlikely ally, her something more. The Blackwoods attacked with a savage fury, their guns blazing, their voices raised in blood-curdling yells. The night erupted in a chaos of gunfire, shouting, and the screams of horses. Joe and Mercer fought side by side, their movements coordinated, their aim deadly. They moved from window to window, from building to building, returning fire, protecting each other, their teamwork seamless and instinctive. Joe found a strength she didn't know she possessed, a courage that surprised even herself. She fired her gun with a steady hand, her aim true, her focus unwavering. She was fighting for her life, for her home, for the man beside her. The battle raged on, a brutal, unrelenting struggle for survival. Joe saw men fall, Both Blackwoods and ranch hands, their bodies crumpling to the ground, their lives extinguished in a flash of violence. She saw Mercer, his face grim and determined, his movements fluid and deadly, taking down one outlaw after another. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of destruction, his every shot finding its mark. But then, she saw him falter. She saw a bullet strike him, his body jerking, his gun falling from his grasp. He stumbled, his hand clutching his side, his face contorted in pain.
Jack!
Jo screamed, her voice filled with terror. She rushed to his side, ignoring the bullets that whizzed past her, the danger that surrounded her. She knelt beside him, her hands reaching for him, her heart breaking. He was hurt, badly hurt. And this time, she wasn't sure if he would survive. The long road home, it seemed, was about to become even longer, and much more treacherous. All she wanted was to get Jack home. Chapter 11. Scars of the Past. Jo managed to drag Mercer to relative safety behind a water trough, the bullets still flying thick and fast around them. She pressed her hand against his wound, trying to staunch the flow of blood, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. He was losing consciousness, his face pale and clammy, his breathing shallow and ragged. "Stay with me, Jack," she pleaded, her voice choked with emotion. "Stay with me, please." He opened his eyes, his gaze flickering, unfocused. He tried to speak, but only a groan escaped his lips.
"Don't talk," Jo said, her voice trembling.
"Save your strength." She ripped a strip of cloth from her skirt and used it to bandage his wound, her hands shaking, her movements clumsy with fear. She had to get him to safety, had to get him help. But she was surrounded, trapped, the battle still raging around them. She looked around desperately, searching for a way out, a glimmer of hope. The ranch hands were still fighting, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, their resistance weakening. The Blackwoods were relentless, their attack brutal and unforgiving. She saw Jedediah Blackwood, his face contorted in a mask of hatred and rage, his gun trained on her. He was about to fire. Suddenly, a figure stepped in front of her, shielding her from Jedediah's aim. It was one of the ranch hands, a young man named Miguel, who had always been quiet and shy, but who now stood tall and defiant, his rifle raised. He fired, his shot hitting Jedediah square in the chest. The outlaw leader staggered backward, his gun falling from his grasp, his body crumpling to the ground. The remaining Blackwoods, seeing their leader fall, hesitated, their attack faltering. They looked at each other, their expressions uncertain, their resolve wavering. Then, one by one, they began to retreat, turning their horses and fleeing back towards the canyon, their voices fading into the night. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the groans of the wounded, the sobs of the bereaved, the crackling of the flames that had engulfed one of the outbuildings. Jo remained huddled beside Mercer, her hand still pressed against his wound, her body trembling with shock and relief. The battle was over. They had survived. But at what cost? The other ranch hands, those who were still able, gathered around them, their faces grim, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. They helped Jo carry Mercer into the house, laying him gently on a bed in one of the spare rooms. Jo stayed by his side, tending to his wounds, her touch gentle, her heart aching. She cleaned the blood from his face, smoothed his hair, whispered words of comfort and encouragement, even though she didn't know if he could hear her. As she worked, she noticed a scar on his chest, a long, jagged scar that ran from his shoulder to his ribs. It was an old scar, faded and pale, but still visible, a reminder of a past filled with violence and pain. She touched the scar gently, her fingers tracing its outline, her mind filled with questions. What had happened to him? What had he endured? What other scars did he carry, hidden beneath his skin, buried deep within his soul? She knew he had a past, a dark and troubled past. He'd told her as much, but she'd never fully grasped the extent of it, the depth of his pain, the burden he carried. Now, seeing him lying there, vulnerable and wounded, his life hanging in the balance. She realized how little she knew about him, how much she still had to learn. She stayed with him throughout the night, watching over him, praying for him, her heart filled with a mixture of fear, hope, and a growing, undeniable love. She had come to care for him deeply, more deeply than she had ever thought possible. He had become more than just a protector, more than just an ally. He had become a part of her life, a part of her heart. As the dawn broke, casting a pale, golden light over the ravaged landscape, Mercer finally stirred. He opened his eyes, his gaze focusing on Joe, his expression filled with a mixture of confusion and pain.
"Yeah,"
he whispered, his voice weak and raspy. "I'm here," she said, her voice choked with emotion. She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I'm here, Jack. You're safe." He smiled, a weak, fleeting smile. "You saved me," he whispered. "We saved each other," she said, her voice trembling. He closed his eyes, his breathing becoming more regular, his body relaxing. He was going to be all right. He was going to survive. And as Joe sat there, holding his hand, watching him sleep, she knew that their journey was far from over. They had a long road ahead of them, a road filled with challenges, with obstacles, with the scars of the past. But they would face it together. They would heal together. They would find their way together. She knew this, with absolute clarity, with a feeling that it had all been fated since the very beginning. Chapter 12. The Serpent's Tooth. Mercer's recovery was slow and arduous. The bullet had done significant damage, and he'd lost a lot of blood. Joe tended to him tirelessly, changing his bandages, feeding him broth, keeping a constant vigil by his bedside. Caleb, though still weak and in pain himself, offered what help he could, his gruff concern a testament to his growing respect for Mercer. As Mercer regained his strength, he began to talk more about his past, revealing fragments of his life with the Blackwoods, the events that had led to his departure, the betrayals he had suffered. He spoke of his childhood, growing up in the shadow of his uncle, Jedediah, a cruel and ruthless man who had instilled in him a code of violence and lawlessness. He spoke of his brothers, his cousins, the bonds of loyalty that had tied them together, the oaths they had sworn. He spoke of the raids they had carried out, the robberies, the killings, the guilt that had slowly eaten away at him, the growing realization that he was on the wrong path, that he was becoming the very thing he despised. He spoke of his decision to leave, the confrontation with Jedediah, the threats, the violence, the desperate escape that had led him to redemption, to Joe. Joe listened patiently, her heart aching for him, her understanding of him deepening with each revelation. She saw the pain in his eyes, the regret, the self-loathing, the yearning for redemption. She also saw the strength in him, the resilience, the determination to change, to become a better man, to escape the shadow of his past. One afternoon, as Mercer was sitting up in bed, looking stronger and more like himself, Joe brought him a cup of coffee and sat down beside him. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice serious, his eyes searching hers. Joe braced herself, her heart tightening with apprehension. She knew this was coming, knew there were still secrets he was keeping, darkness he had yet to reveal. "When I left the Blackwoods," he began, his voice low and strained, "I didn't just run. I took something with me. Something that belonged to them. Something valuable." Joe's eyes widened. "What?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. He looked out the window, at the vast expanse of the ranch, the peaceful landscape that belied the turmoil inside him. "Gold," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "A lot of gold. From a bank robbery in Santa Fe. The last job we did together." Joe stared at him, her mind reeling. She'd suspected there was more to his story, more to his reasons for leaving the Blackwoods. But gold? A stolen fortune? "Where is it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and defiance. "It's hidden," he said. "Safe. Where they'll never find it." "But why did you take it?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion. Why risk everything? He sighed, his shoulders slumping. It wasn't about the money, Joe, he said. It was about leverage. About making sure they wouldn't come after me. About buying my freedom. But they did come after you, she said, her voice rising slightly. They almost killed you. They almost killed us all. I know, he said, his voice filled with regret. I underestimated them. I underestimated Jedediah's ruthlessness. His obsession. He paused, his gaze locking onto hers. There's something else, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Something I haven't told anyone. Something about Jedediah. Jo leaned closer, her heart pounding in her chest. She sensed this was the core of it, the deepest secret, the darkest truth. Jedediah, he's not just my uncle, Mercer said, his voice choked with emotion. He's my father. Jo gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, stunning her into silence. Jedediah, the cruel, ruthless outlaw leader, was Mercer's father? The man he had shot, the man he had left for dead, was his own flesh and blood? It was a betrayal of Shakespearean proportions. A serpent's tooth, indeed. How much sharper could it be? The implications of all this made her feel sick and confused. Chapter 13. A Reckoning at Dawn. The revelation of Mercer's true parentage hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jo struggled to process the information, her mind reeling from the implications. It explained so much. Mercer's internal conflict, his deep-seated guilt, his desperate desire to escape his past. It also cast a new light on Jedediah's relentless pursuit, his obsessive need to control and punish his son. I don't know what to say, Jo finally whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of shock and compassion. Mercer looked away, his gaze fixed on the floor, his expression a mask of shame and pain. There's nothing to say, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It's the truth. The ugly, brutal truth. But why didn't you tell me sooner? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. I was ashamed, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Afraid. Afraid of what you would think. Afraid of losing you. Jo reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His skin was warm and rough, his grip surprisingly strong. You could never lose me, Jack, she said, her voice firm, unwavering. Not like this. Not because of your past. Not because of who your father was. He looked at her, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He saw the sincerity in her gaze, the unwavering acceptance, the unconditional love. I don't deserve you, Jo, he said, his voice choked with emotion. Don't say that, she said, her voice rising slightly. You deserve happiness, Jack. You deserve a second chance. We all do. They sat in silence for a long moment, their hands clasped together, their hearts connected by an invisible thread. The weight of his past, the burden of his secrets, seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a fragile hope, a glimmer of possibility. But the peace was short-lived. A shout from outside, a frantic cry from one of the ranch hands, shattered the stillness. Riders. Coming fast. Mercer and Jo exchanged a look of alarm. They knew who it was. The Blackwoods. They were back. Mercer struggled to get out of bed, his movements hampered by his injury. Jo tried to stop him, her concern for his well-being overriding her fear. You're not strong enough, she said, her voice pleading. You need to rest. He pushed her aside gently, his expression determined. I have to, he said, his voice firm. I have to finish this. Once and for all. He grabbed his gun, his movements still stiff and painful, but his resolve unwavering. He looked at Jo, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. Stay here, he said, his voice a low, urgent command. Stay safe. I'll handle this. No, Jo said, her voice defiant. I'm not staying behind. I'm with you. We face this together. She grabbed her own gun, her father's Colt Peacemaker, the familiar weight comforting in her grip. She was ready. She would stand by his side no matter what. They stepped out of the house, into the early morning light. The sun was just rising, casting a pale, golden glow over the landscape. But the beauty of the dawn was overshadowed by the approaching riders, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun, their guns glinting menacingly. It wasn't the entire Blackwood gang. Only a handful of riders remained, their numbers depleted by the previous battles. But they were still dangerous, still determined, still driven by a thirst for revenge. And leading them, his figure tall and imposing, his face a mask of fury, was a man Joe had thought dead. Jedediah Blackwood. He was alive. He was wounded, his arm in a sling, his body bearing the scars of the previous battle. But he was alive. And he was here for a reckoning. The confrontation was brief, brutal, and inevitable. Gunfire erupted, echoing across the valley, shattering the morning stillness. Joe and Mercer fought side by side, their movements coordinated, their aim deadly. They were fighting for their lives, for their future, for the chance to finally break free from the shadows of the past. It was a reckoning at dawn, a final showdown between father and son, between good and evil, between the past and the future. And Joe knew, with a chilling certainty, that not everyone would survive. The air was thick with gunpowder and the stench of death. Who would live? Who would die? Chapter 14. The Weight of Gold. The gunfight was a whirlwind of chaos and violence. Joe and Mercer moved with a practiced ease, born of desperation and a shared will to survive. They took cover behind wagons, fences, anything that offered even a sliver of protection from the relentless barrage of bullets. Joe found herself surprisingly calm amidst the chaos, her focus narrowed to the immediate threat, her movements instinctive and precise. She fired her father's Colt with a steady hand, her aim true, her every shot fueled by a fierce determination to protect herself, to protect Mercer, to protect the life they were fighting for. She saw Jedediah, his face contorted in a mask of hatred, his eyes burning with a cold, predatory light. He was a formidable opponent, even wounded, his movements driven by a ruthless determination that bordered on madness. She saw Mercer, his face grim and resolute, his movements fluid and deadly, his every shot aimed at his father, his former family, the men he had once ridden with, the men he was now forced to kill. The battle raged on, the sounds of gunfire echoing across the valley, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Joe saw ranch hands fall, their bodies crumpling to the ground, their lives extinguished in a flash of violence. She saw Blackwood's fall, their horses rearing and screaming, their riders collapsing in the dust. Then she saw Mercer take a hit. A bullet grazed his arm, tearing through his flesh, drawing a cry of pain from his lips. He stumbled, his gun falling from his grasp, his body momentarily vulnerable. Jedediah saw his opportunity. He raised his gun, aiming at his son, his finger tightening on the trigger.
Jag är instinktiv.
She raised her own gun, aiming at Jedediah, her fingers squeezing the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing across the valley. Jedediah staggered backward, his gun firing harmlessly into the air, his body crumpling to the ground. He lay there, still and silent, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. The remaining Blackwoods, seeing their leader fall, their father slain by the woman Mercer loved, lost their nerve. They turned their horses and fled, disappearing into the distance, their defeat complete, their reign of terror finally over. Joe rushed to Mercer's side, her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling with relief and fear. He was alive, but he was wounded, his arm bleeding profusely. "Jack," she cried, her voice choked with emotion. "Are you all right?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. He nodded weakly, his face pale and drawn. "I'm okay," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You saved me again." "It's over," she said, her voice trembling. "It's finally over." She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight, her arm around his waist. They stood there for a long moment, clinging to each other, their bodies shaking with the aftermath of the battle, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief, sorrow, and a fragile hope. The other ranch hands, those who had survived, gathered around them, their faces etched with grief and exhaustion. They had won, but the victory had come at a heavy price. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a golden light over the ravaged landscape, Joe and Mercer turned their attention to the future. The immediate threat was gone, but the challenges remained. They had to rebuild the ranch, to heal their wounds, both physical and emotional, to come to terms with the events of the past few weeks. And they had to decide what to do with the gold. The stolen fortune that had been the catalyst for so much violence and bloodshed. Mercer, weakened by his injuries, leaned heavily on Joe. "It's yours," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Do what you want with it." Joe looked at him, her eyes filled with compassion and understanding. She knew the gold represented more than just money. It was a symbol of his past, of his guilt, of his desire for redemption. "It's not mine, Jack," she said, her voice firm. "It's not yours either. It belongs to the people it was stolen from." He looked at her, his eyes questioning. "We'll return it," she said, her voice unwavering. "We'll find a way to get it back to the bank in Santa Fe. We'll do the right thing." He smiled weakly, a flicker of relief crossing his features. "You're amazing, Joe," he whispered. "We're amazing," she said, her voice filled with love and determination. Together, the weight of gold, the burden of the past, seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a sense of purpose, a shared commitment to building a better future, a future free from the shadows of violence and greed. A future built on honesty, integrity, and love. The future was unwritten, but they would face it, as they always had, together. Chapter 15. The Unforgiven. The journey to Santa Fe was long and arduous. Mercer was still recovering from his wounds, and Joe insisted on taking it slow, prioritizing his health and well-being above all else. They traveled by wagon, accompanied by two of the most trusted ranch hands, Miguel and a grizzled older man named Silas, who had been a friend of Joe's father. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, a vast expanse of desert and mountains, stretching out before them like an endless sea of sand and rock. The days were hot and dusty, the nights cold and lonely. But they persevered, their determination fueled by a shared sense of purpose, a commitment to righting the wrongs of the past. As they traveled, Joe and Mercer talked, sharing their stories, their hopes, their fears. They spoke of their childhoods, their families, the events that had shaped their lives. They spoke of their dreams for the future, of building a life together, of finding peace and happiness amidst the challenges of the frontier. Mercer revealed more about his time with the Blackwoods, the details of the robberies they had committed, the violence they had inflicted. He spoke of his growing disillusionment, his disgust with his uncle's cruelty, his yearning for a different life. He also spoke of his father, the man he had killed, the man he had hated and loved in equal measure. He spoke of the guilt that consumed him, the nightmares that haunted him, the fear that he would never be able to escape the shadow of his past. Joe listened patiently, her heart aching for him, her understanding of him deepening with each conversation. She offered him comfort, support, and an unwavering belief in his ability to change, to become the man he wanted to be. She also shared her own stories, her own struggles, her own losses. She spoke of her father, her husband who died of fever before she'd really begun to love him, her life on the ranch, the challenges she had faced as a woman in a man's world. They grew closer with each passing day, their bond strengthening, their love deepening. They found solace in each other's company, a shared understanding that transcended words, a connection that defied the harsh realities of their surroundings. One evening, as they were camped by a small stream, the stars shining brightly overhead, Mercer turned to Joe, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Joe," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved my life, in more ways than one." Joe smiled, her heart filled with love for this man who had endured so much, who had fought so hard, who had finally found his way home. "We saved each other, Jack," she said, her voice soft. "We found each other." And that's all that matters. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His skin was warm and rough, his grip surprisingly strong. "I love you, Joe," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I love you more than I ever thought possible." Joe's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy, tears of relief, tears of a love that had blossomed amidst the dust and violence of the frontier. "I love you too, Jack," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I love you with all my heart." They kissed, a long, slow, tender kiss that sealed their bond, that promised a future together, a future free from the shadows of the past. But the past was not so easily escaped. As they neared Santa Fe, they encountered a group of men, heavily armed, their faces grim and determined. They were bounty hunters, drawn by the rumors of the stolen gold, the whispers of the outlaw Jack Mercer. They recognized Mercer instantly, their eyes glinting with greed and anticipation. They surrounded the wagon, their guns trained on him, their intentions clear. "Jack Mercer," one of the men said, his voice harsh and grating. "You're under arrest for robbery, murder, and a whole host of other crimes." Mercer's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. He knew this was coming, had expected it, had prepared for it. But he wasn't going to surrender. Not without a fight. He was no longer the man he was, and he'd not be treated like some criminal. "I'm not going back," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "I'm not going to prison for crimes I committed under the influence of a man I no longer recognize as family." The standoff began. Joe, however, had other plans. She knew that even if they fought their way free now, they'd be looking over their shoulder forever. There was only one path forward that might buy them peace. "I'm returning the gold," she stated, her voice clear and ringing out to everyone present. It was a daring ploy, a move he hadn't seen coming. Would it work? The weight of the unforgiven past, it seemed, was about to be tested. Chapter 16. Where the River Bends. Joe's declaration hung in the air, a sudden shift in the tense standoff. The bounty hunters, initially focused on capturing Mercer, shifted their gaze to her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Mercer looked at Joe, his eyes questioning, a flicker of hope mixed with apprehension. "The gold?" The leader of the bounty hunters, a burly man with a scarred face, said, his voice still harsh but laced with a hint of curiosity. "You have the gold?" "Yes," Joe said, her voice firm and unwavering. "All of it. We were on our way to Santa Fe to return it to the bank." The bounty hunters exchanged glances, their skepticism evident. They had heard tales of Mercer's ruthlessness, his cunning, his ability to escape even the tightest situations. They weren't about to be fooled by some woman's pretty words. "Prove it," the leader said, his hand still resting on his gun. "Show us the gold." Joe nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was a gamble, a risky maneuver that could either save them or condemn them. But she had faith in Mercer, in their shared commitment to doing the right thing, in the power of truth and redemption. She climbed into the back of the wagon, Silas and Miguel flanking her protectively, their hands resting on their own weapons, ready to defend her if necessary. She opened a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, revealing a series of heavy canvas bags. The bounty hunters crowded around, their eyes widening as they saw the gold, the glint of the precious metal reflecting the sunlight. It was a substantial amount, a fortune that could change their lives. "It's all there," Joe said, her voice steady. "Every last ounce. We were going to return it anonymously. We didn't want any reward, any recognition. We just wanted to do what was right." The leader of the bounty hunters, his eyes still narrowed, looked from the gold to Joe, then to Mercer. He was assessing them, weighing their words, their actions, their intentions.
"Why?"
he finally asked, his voice softer now, less hostile. "Why would you do this? Why would you return stolen gold, especially when you could have easily kept it, disappeared, started a new life?" Mercer stepped forward, his gaze locking onto the bounty hunters. "Because I'm not that man anymore," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "I'm not the outlaw I used to be. I'm trying to change, to make amends for my past. Returning this gold is part of that. It's the right thing to do. The bounty hunter studied him for a long moment, his eyes searching, probing. He saw the sincerity in Mercer's gaze, the weariness, the regret, the determination to change. He saw the love between Mercer and Joe, the strength of their bond, the shared commitment to a better future. He lowered his gun, his posture relaxing slightly. "All right," he said, his voice grudgingly respectful. "I believe you. But that doesn't change the fact that you have a price on your head, Mercer. There are warrants out for your arrest. I have a job to do." Mercer nodded, his expression resigned. He knew this was a possibility, had anticipated it. He was prepared to face the consequences of his past actions, even if it meant imprisonment. But Joe wasn't about to let that happen. She stepped forward, her voice clear and determined. "He's returning the gold," she said, her gaze fixed on the bounty hunter. "He's cooperating. He's trying to make amends. Surely that counts for something. Surely there's a way to resolve this without taking him to prison." The bounty hunter hesitated, his mind clearly weighing the options. He could take Mercer in, collect the reward, and be hailed as a hero. Or he could show mercy, allow Mercer a chance at redemption, and risk the wrath of his superiors, the potential loss of his own reputation. He looked at Joe, at her unwavering gaze, her fierce determination, her love for this man who had once been an outlaw. He saw the strength in her, the resilience, the unwavering belief in the power of second chances. He made his decision. "There might be a way," he said, his voice thoughtful. "The bank manager in Santa Fe, he's a fair man. A good man. If you return the gold, and if you both vouch for Mercer's character, his change of heart, he might be willing to drop the charges. Or, at least reduce them." It was a glimmer of hope, a chance at a future free from the constant threat of imprisonment, a possibility of building a life together without the shadow of the past hanging over them. They rode into Santa Fe together, the bounty hunters accompanying them, ensuring the gold was safely delivered to the bank. The bank manager, a stern but compassionate man, listened to their story, examined the gold, and questioned Mercer extensively. He was impressed by their honesty, their willingness to return the stolen fortune, their commitment to making amends. He was also moved by Joe's unwavering support for Mercer, her belief in his redemption, her love for a man who had once been on the wrong side of the law. In the end, he made a decision that surprised everyone. He agreed to drop the most serious charges against Mercer in exchange for his cooperation in providing information about any remaining members of the Blackwood gang who might still be at large, and a promise of continued good behavior. It was a lenient sentence, a second chance, a testament to the power of redemption, the transformative power of love. The river of their lives, it seemed, was bending, turning towards a new, brighter course. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer held them captive. They were free, together, and that, they both knew, was all that mattered. This was what mattered. Chapter 17. The Heart's Compass. With the charges against Mercer reduced and the gold safely returned, a sense of relief washed over Joe and Mercer. They spent a few days in Santa Fe, resting, recuperating, and making arrangements for their future. Mercer, though still bearing the physical and emotional scars of his past, seemed lighter, freer, his spirit renewed by the prospect of a fresh start. Joe found herself drawn to the bustling town, a stark contrast to the quiet isolation of the ranch. She enjoyed exploring the shops, talking to the people, experiencing a sense of community she hadn't felt in a long time. But her heart longed for home, for the familiar comfort of the ranch, for the life she had built, the life she now wanted to share with Mercer. They purchased supplies, new clothes, and a few small luxuries they had long gone without. They also visited a lawyer, drawing up papers to ensure the ranch was legally secured in Joe's name, with provisions for Mercer as her partner, her husband, should they choose to marry. One evening, as they were strolling along the main street, the setting sun casting a warm, golden glow over the town, Mercer turned to Joe, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and anticipation. "Joe," he said, his voice soft, his hand reaching for hers. I know we haven't talked much about the future, about us. But I want you to know I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to build a life with you, on the ranch, together. Joe's heart swelled with love for this man who had endured so much, who had fought so hard, who had finally found his way to her. She smiled, her eyes shining with tears of joy. I want that too, Jack, she said, her voice choked with emotion.
More than anything.
He stopped walking, turning to face her, his hands cupping her face. He looked at her, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, filled with a love that was both fierce and tender. Will you marry me, Joe? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Will you be my wife? Joe's answer was a kiss, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their commitment, that promised a lifetime of love, of partnership, of shared dreams. Yes, she whispered, her lips against his. Yes, I will. They returned to the ranch a few days later, welcomed by Caleb and the other ranch hands with a mixture of relief and celebration. Caleb, though still recovering from his injuries, greeted Mercer with a gruff nod and a surprisingly warm smile. He had come to respect and trust the man who had saved his life, who had become Joe's partner, her love, her future. The ranch felt different now, transformed by the events of the past few weeks. The scars of the battles remained, visible reminders of the violence and loss they had endured. But there was also a sense of renewal, of hope, of a new beginning. Joe and Mercer set about rebuilding, repairing the damage, restoring the ranch to its former glory, and creating a home for themselves, a sanctuary where they could heal, grow, and build a life together. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized, their communication effortless, their love a constant presence in everything they did. They planted a garden, tended to the livestock, mended fences, and slowly, gradually, the ranch began to thrive again. They also made plans for their wedding, a simple ceremony to be held at the ranch, with Caleb and the other ranch hands as witnesses. They wanted a celebration of their love, a testament to their resilience, a symbol of their commitment to each other and to their future. Joe found herself happier than she had ever been, her heart filled with a love that was both profound and enduring. She had found her partner, her soulmate, her home. She had found a man who loved her for who she was, flaws and all, a man who accepted her past, who supported her dreams, who shared her vision for the future. Mercer helped her select a spot near the creek. The preparations were simple. The ceremony would be two, and at the center of it would be two hearts, guided home at last. The heart's compass, it seemed, had led them exactly where they needed to be.
To each other.
Chapter 18. Trials of Fire. The wedding preparations proceeded smoothly, infused with a quiet joy that permeated the ranch. Joe and Mercer, with the help of Caleb and the ranch hands, transformed the area near the creek into a beautiful, rustic setting for their ceremony. They built an archway of branches and wildflowers, arranged benches for the guests, and strung lanterns in the trees, creating a magical, intimate atmosphere. Joe, with the help of a local seamstress, fashioned a simple but elegant dress from a bolt of cream-colored linen she had purchased in Santa Fe. She added lace trim and delicate embroidery, her stitches imbued with love and anticipation. Mercer, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to prepare the ranch for the celebration, ensuring everything was in perfect order, his every action a testament to his devotion to Joe and his commitment to their future. But as the wedding day drew closer, a new challenge arose, a test of their resilience, a trial of fire that threatened to disrupt their carefully laid plans. A group of men arrived at the ranch, strangers to Joe and Mercer, their faces hard, their eyes wary. They were led by a stern-looking man with a badge pinned to his vest, identifying him as a U.S. Marshal. Jack Mercer? The Marshal said, his voice firm and authoritative. Mercer stepped forward, his expression calm but guarded. I am, he said. The Marshal nodded, his gaze sweeping over Joe, Caleb, and the assembled ranch hands. I have a warrant for your arrest, he said, his voice unwavering. Joe's heart sank. She felt a wave of fear and disbelief wash over her. Not again.
Not now.
Not when they were so close to their happily ever after. On what charges? Mercer asked, his voice steady, but laced with a hint of defiance. Obstruction of justice, the marshal said. Harboring a fugitive. Aiding and abetting a known criminal. The charges were serious, potentially carrying a lengthy prison sentence. Joe knew this was related to the Blackwoods, to Mercer's past, to the lingering shadow of the law that still hung over him. These charges are false, Joe said, stepping forward, her voice strong and clear. Jack Mercer has cooperated with the authorities. He returned the stolen gold. He helped bring down the Blackwood gang. He deserves a chance at a new life. The marshal looked at her, his expression unmoved. That may be, ma'am, he said. But the law is the law, and I have a duty to enforce it. Mercer placed a hand on Joe's arm, his touch calming and reassuring. It's all right, Joe, he said, his voice soft. I'll go with them. I'll face whatever comes. He turned to the marshal, his expression resigned. I'm ready, he said. Joe couldn't let it happen. She wouldn't let them take him away. Not now, not when they were so close to their wedding, to their future together. No, she said, her voice rising. There has to be another way. There has to be something we can do. Caleb stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun, his expression grim. The other ranch hands followed suit, their loyalty to Joe and Mercer unwavering. You'll have to go through us first, Caleb said, his voice a low growl. The marshal and his men tensed, their hands moving to their own weapons. A standoff was brewing, a potentially violent confrontation that could end in bloodshed. Joe knew she had to act quickly, to defuse the situation, to find a solution that would avoid violence and protect Mercer. Wait, she said, her voice pleading. Please. There's someone you need to talk to. Someone who can vouch for Jack. Someone who can explain everything. The marshal hesitated, his eyes narrowing. Who? He asked. The bank manager in Santa Fe, Joe said. Mr. Thompson. He knows the whole story. He knows about the gold, about Jack's cooperation, about his change of heart. He's the one who dropped the original charges. He can tell you everything. The marshal considered her words, his mind weighing the options. He could proceed with the arrest, risking a violent confrontation, or he could take a chance, verify Joe's story, and potentially avoid unnecessary bloodshed. He made his decision. All right, he said, his voice grudgingly. We'll ride to Santa Fe. We'll talk to Mr. Thompson. But if this turns out to be a trick, Mercer, you'll pay the price. The marshal agreed. The wedding was postponed. The trial of fire, it seemed, was far from over. And Joe knew that their future hung in the balance. Chapter 19. A promise kept. The ride back to Santa Fe was tense and filled with uncertainty. Joe and Mercer rode alongside the marshal and his men, the weight of the potential consequences hanging heavy in the air. Joe couldn't shake the feeling of dread, the fear that their hard-won happiness was about to be snatched away from them. Mercer, however, remained calm and resolute. He had faced adversity before, had stared death in the face, and he was prepared to face whatever came his way. He held Joe's hand tightly, his touch reassuring, his presence a source of strength and comfort. When they arrived in Santa Fe, they went directly to the bank, where Mr. Thompson greeted them with a mixture of surprise and concern. Joe quickly explained the situation, the new charges against Mercer, the marshal's determination to arrest him. Mr. Thompson listened patiently, his expression thoughtful. He knew the whole story, had been instrumental in securing Mercer's initial release, and he believed in the man's genuine desire for redemption. He turned to the marshal, his voice firm and authoritative. Marshal, he said, I can vouch for Mr. Mercer. He has cooperated fully with the authorities. He returned the stolen gold, provided valuable information about the Blackwood gang, and has demonstrated a sincere commitment to changing his life. The marshal, however, remained skeptical. He still has a past, Mr. Thompson, he said. A history of violence and lawlessness. These new charges are serious. I understand that, Marshal, Mr. Thompson said. But I also believe in second chances. I believe in the power of redemption. And I believe that Mr. Mercer deserves a chance to prove himself, to build a new life, a life free from the shadows of his past. He then recounted the details of Mercer's cooperation, his bravery in facing his former family, his unwavering commitment to returning the stolen gold. He emphasized Jo's role in his transformation, her unwavering support, her love, her belief in his ability to change. The marshal listened intently, his expression slowly changing. He saw the sincerity in Mr. Thompson's eyes, the conviction in his voice, the weight of his testimony. He also saw the love between Jo and Mercer, the strength of their bond, the shared commitment to a better future. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "All right, Mr. Thompson," he said. "I'll take your word for it. I'll drop the charges against Mercer." A wave of relief washed over Jo, her body trembling with the release of tension. Mercer squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. But the marshal continued, his voice firm, "Mercer is on probation. He's to report to me regularly. He's to stay out of trouble. Any violation of these terms, and he'll be back in custody, facing the full force of the law." Mercer nodded, his expression serious. "I understand, Marshal," he said. "I won't disappoint you. I won't disappoint Jo. I'm done with my old life. I'm committed to building a new one." With the charges dropped and Mercer's freedom secured, they returned to the ranch, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of hope and gratitude. The wedding preparations resumed, infused with an even greater joy, a deeper appreciation for the preciousness of their love, the fragility of their hard-won happiness. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, the sky a vast expanse of blue, the air filled with the scent of wildflowers and the promise of a new beginning. Jo and Mercer stood beneath the archway of branches and blossoms, their hands clasped together, their eyes locked in a gaze of love and commitment. Caleb, standing beside them as Mercer's best man, his gruff exterior softened by a rare smile, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and affection. The ranch hands, dressed in their Sunday best, gathered around, their faces beaming with happiness for Jo and Mercer. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, their vows spoken with a sincerity and depth of emotion that brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. They exchanged rings, simple bands of gold, symbols of their enduring love, their unbreakable bond, their shared future. As they kissed, a cheer erupted from the assembled guests, a celebration of their love, their resilience, their triumph over adversity. They had faced trials of fire, had endured hardship and loss, had overcome the shadows of the past, and had emerged stronger, more united, their love a beacon of hope in a world often filled with darkness. Jo and Mercer, husband and wife, stood hand in hand, their hearts overflowing with love and gratitude, their future stretching out before them, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with the colors of their shared dreams. The promise, made long ago, was finally kept. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The wedding celebration was a joyous affair, filled with laughter, music, and dancing. The ranch hands, along with friends and neighbors from Redemption, gathered to celebrate Jo and Mercer's union, their hearts filled with warmth and goodwill. The long tables groaned under the weight of food and drink, and the air was filled with the sounds of merriment and camaraderie. Jo, radiant in her simple but elegant dress, moved among the guests, her smile bright, her eyes shining with happiness. She felt a sense of belonging, of community, of connection that she had not experienced in a long time. She had found her home, her family, her love. Mercer, standing by her side, his arm around her waist, his gaze filled with pride and affection, felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He had escaped the shadows of his past, had found redemption in Jo's love, and had built a new life, a life filled with purpose, with meaning, with hope. As the evening wore on, the music slowed, the dancing subsided, and the guests began to depart, their hearts full, their spirits lifted. Jo and Mercer stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching the last of the wagons disappear into the distance, the setting sun casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape. They turned to each other, their eyes meeting, their hearts overflowing with love. They had endured so much, had overcome so many obstacles, had fought so hard for their happiness. And now, finally, they were together, husband and wife, their future stretching out before them, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with the colors of their shared dreams. "I love you, Joe," Mercer said, his voice soft, his hand reaching out to caress her cheek. "I love you too, Jack," Joe said, her voice choked with emotion, her eyes shining with tears of joy. They kissed a long, slow, tender kiss that sealed their bond, that promised a lifetime of love, of companionship, of shared adventures. But even in this moment of perfect happiness, a shadow lingered, a reminder of the past, a final confrontation that had to be faced. As they stood there, embracing, they saw a lone rider approaching the ranch, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. He rode slowly, deliberately, his posture suggesting a purpose, a determination. Joe and Mercer tensed, their bodies instinctively preparing for danger. They recognized the rider, even from a distance. It was one of the bounty hunters, the leader, the man who had almost taken Mercer back to prison, the man who had ultimately relented, who had given them a chance. He reined in his horse a few feet away from them, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on Mercer. "Mercer," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "What is it?" Mercer asked, his voice calm but guarded. The bounty hunter reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He tossed it to Mercer, who caught it instinctively. "What's this?" Mercer asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Jedediah Blackwood's," the bounty hunter said. "Found it on him after you left him." Mercer's heart skipped a beat. He looked at the pouch, his hands trembling slightly. He recognized it instantly. It was his father's, his real father's, a pouch he had carried with him always, a pouch that contained what? He opened the pouch, his fingers fumbling with the drawstrings. He poured the contents into his hand. A single object, a small, tarnished silver locket. He opened the locket, his breath catching in his throat. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, one of a young woman, beautiful and vibrant, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The other of a young man, handsome and rugged, with a hint of sadness in his eyes, a hint of the darkness that would later consume him. Mercer recognized the woman. It was his mother. He had never seen a picture of her before, had only heard stories, whispered tales of her beauty, her kindness, her tragic death. And the man was Jedediah. Before the cruelty, before the violence, before the darkness had taken hold. He looked different. Younger, hopeful, almost innocent. Mercer felt a wave of emotion wash over him, a mixture of grief, regret, and a strange, unexpected sense of understanding. He saw, for the first time, the man his father had once been, the man he could have been, the man he might have become if circumstances had been different. He closed the locket, his hand clutching it tightly. It was a final message from his past, a reminder of the man he had killed, the man who had shaped his life, the man he had both hated and loved. It was a burden and a key.
"Why?"
Mercer asked the bounty hunter quietly. "Why bring this to me?" "He wanted you to have it," the bounty hunter shrugged.
"Said it was yours by right."
I didn't rightly understand him, but I figured I ought to honor the request. He looked away and added quietly, "He also said to tell you he was sorry." Mercer nodded, his throat too tight to speak. It changed nothing, and everything. Joe put an arm around him, her presence comforting. The bounty hunter tipped his hat. "Good luck, Mercer," he said, and rode away. The final confrontation, it seemed, was not one of violence, but of hearts. Of forgiveness, perhaps. Or, at least, understanding. Joe and Mercer stood there, in the fading light, the locket a tangible link to a past that could no longer hurt them, a future that stretched before them, vast and open, like the horizons of the land they loved. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. The sun dipped below the horizon. A new day would soon begin. Epilogue. Years passed, like the slow, steady turning of a wagon wheel, marking the passage of time on the McGraw Ranch, now a testament to resilience, love, and a hard-won peace. The scars of the past remained, etched into the landscape and into the hearts of Joe and Mercer, but they served as reminders of the battles fought, the challenges overcome, and the enduring strength of their bond. The ranch thrived, growing and prospering under their joint stewardship. They expanded the herds, improved the land, and built a life that was both comfortable and fulfilling. They became respected members of the community, known for their honesty, their integrity, and their unwavering commitment to each other and to their neighbors. Caleb remained a steadfast presence, his gruff exterior slowly softening with age, his loyalty to Joe and Mercer unwavering. He became a surrogate grandfather to their children, a source of wisdom and guidance, a living link to the past. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, named after Joe's father and Mercer's mother, a tribute to the legacies that had shaped their lives. The children grew up strong and free, imbued with the spirit of the frontier, the values of hard work, honesty, and compassion. Mercer never fully escaped the shadow of his past, the memories of his time with the Blackwoods, the guilt over his father's death. But he found solace in Joe's love, in the quiet routine of ranch life, in the joy of raising his children, in the knowledge that he had built a new life, a better life, a life worthy of redemption. He often thought of the locket, the final message from his father, the glimpse of the man Jedediah had once been. He kept it tucked away, a reminder of the complexities of human nature, the capacity for both good and evil, the enduring power of love and forgiveness. Joe, her hair now streaked with silver, her face etched with the lines of time and experience, remained the heart and soul of the ranch, her strength and resilience unwavering, her love for Mercer a constant, guiding force. She had found her happiness, her purpose, her home, in the arms of the man who had once been an outlaw, the man who had become her husband, her partner, her soulmate. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange, red, and purple, their grandchildren playing at their feet, Mercer turned to Joe, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "Thank you, Joe," he said, his voice soft, his hand reaching out to caress her cheek. "For what?" she asked, her smile gentle, her eyes shining with love. "For everything," he said. "For saving me. For loving me. For giving me a life I never dreamed possible." Joe leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart overflowing with contentment. They had built a life together, a life filled with love, with family, with purpose. They had faced the trials of fire, had overcome the shadows of the past, and had emerged stronger, more united, their love a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, the stars beginning to appear in the vast, darkening sky. They sat there, in silence, their hands clasped together, their hearts beating as one, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of redemption, a final, beautiful chapter in a story that had begun with a kiss before sundown and had ended with a lifetime of love beneath the endless, starlit sky of the American West. It was a good life, a hard life, but a good one, and they had built it together. The end.